Sometimes, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday, while standing in line for coffee or sitting at a red light, a thought arrives uninvited. The thought is this: what if I could simply stop being here? Not dead, but absent. Not gone, but dissolved. As if the universe might grant you the courtesy of gentle erasure, the way morning mist vanishes when the sun finally remembers to rise. This isn't about wanting to die. That distinction matters more than almost anything else. So let me be absolutely clear. Death is loud, violent, final. Death leaves wreckage and grief and the terrible machinery of endings. What I'm describing is softer, stranger, more paradoxical. It's the wish to have never needed to be at all, to slip between the cracks of existence itself, to become the blank space between words rather than the words themselves. If you felt this even once, even for a moment so brief, you barely registered it before pushing it down into whatever dark cabinet you keep your unspeakable thoughts, then you already understand the central mystery we're exploring together. The feeling has textures. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in shame, after you've said something foolish at a party and spent the drive home replaying every syllable, each one landing heavier than the last. Your face burns, your chest tightens, and somewhere beneath the embarrassment lives something else, something that whispers, "Wouldn't it be easier if I could just vanish?" Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just cease to be the person who said that stupid thing, who exists in other people's memories as a collection of awkward moments and failed attempts at being likable. A German philosopher named Arthur Schopenhauer spent his life trying to understand this weight. He lived in the 19th century, died long before our current vocabulary of mental health existed, yet he managed to articulate something about this feeling that still resonates with uncanny accuracy. He suggested that what we're experiencing isn't personal failing, chemical imbalance, or even situational despair, though it can certainly feel like all those things. Instead, he argued that we're brushing up against a basic truth about what it means to be alive, what it means to be an individual consciousness separate from everything else. He called it the will, not willpower, not personal desire, but something much larger and more impersonal. A blind, relentless force that animates all of existence, that drives every living thing forward into wanting, striving, needing, lacking. According to Schopenhauer, to be alive is to be possessed by this will, to be an instrument of its endless hunger. And here's the crucial part: the will can never be satisfied. It's not designed for satisfaction. It's designed for perpetual wanting. The moment one desire is fulfilled, another immediately takes its place. We exist in a state of constant lack, forever reaching towards something just beyond our grasp. When you feel the desire to disappear, when you long for dissolution, what you're really experiencing, according to this framework, is exhaustion with the will's tyranny. You're tired of wanting, tired of the endless cycle of desire and disappointment, tired of being a vehicle for needs and longings that never fully resolve. The cruel irony is that even the desire to not exist is itself a desire, another manifestation of the very thing you're trying to escape. Other times the feeling comes dressed in a different costume. You wake up and the day ahead unfolds in your mind like an endless hallway of obligations, each door leading to another room of things you must do, people you must be, masks you must wear. At work, you're competent and professional. With friends, you're funny and available. With family, you're patient and present. With lovers, you're vulnerable but not too needy, passionate but not overwhelming. The arithmetic of existing as someone becomes unbearable. Each role requires energy you're not sure you possess, and beneath it all runs a quiet current of longing for the oblivion of simply not having to perform anymore. But be honest with yourself for a moment. How much of this exhaustion comes from genuinely unbearable circumstances? And how much comes from your resistance to those circumstances? How much energy are you burning, not just carrying the weight, but also wishing the weight didn't exist? Schopenhauer would ask you to notice something uncomfortable. The thing that makes you tired isn't just the doing, it's the wanting it to be different. The performance exhausts you, yes, but what exhausts you more is performing while simultaneously wishing you didn't have to perform, wanting relief while knowing relief isn't coming. You're at war with reality, and the will is using that war, that resistance, to perpetuate itself through you. Perhaps most unsettling is when the desire arrives for no reason at all. You're walking through a park. The weather is pleasant. Nothing bad has happened. Your life, objectively measured, contains no catastrophe, yet suddenly you feel it. This heavy certainty that consciousness itself is a burden you never asked to carry. Being aware that you're aware, thinking about thinking. The relentless internal monologue that never fully stops. The weight of memory and anticipation. The prison of being trapped inside a single perspective. A single body. A single name that everyone uses to refer to the collection of stories and scars you've accumulated. In these moments, the desire to disappear isn't about escaping pain. It's about escaping the exhausting project of being someone at all. Most people never speak about this. We've built elaborate social contracts around what thoughts are permissible to voice and what must remain locked away. Mental health conversations have opened many doors, and for that, we should be grateful. We can talk about depression, anxiety, trauma. We can even, carefully, talk about suicidal ideation in clinical terms. But this thing, this desire for dissolution rather than death, this longing to be unmade rather than destroyed, exists in a strange linguistic gap. It feels too dramatic to mention, yet too persistent to ignore. Too philosophical to bring up in therapy, yet too painful to be merely intellectual. The silence around it creates a peculiar isolation. When you feel it alone. You assume, perhaps, that this is evidence of some fundamental brokenness inside you, that healthy people don't wish they could dissolve like salt in water, don't fantasize about non-existence the way others might fantasize about vacation. You look around at everyone else, all these people who seem to wear their existence so comfortably, who never appear burdened by the sheer fact of being conscious, of having to be themselves every single day without pause or vacation. You conclude that this feeling is yours alone, a private defect, a shameful secret. But here's what you need to understand. This feeling is old. Older than you, older than this moment, older than the particular shape of suffering that modern life creates. Human beings have been grappling with this desire for as long as we've been conscious enough to question our own consciousness. It appears in ancient texts, in religious traditions, in philosophical treatises, written centuries before our current vocabulary existed. The words change, the cultural context shifts, but the essential experience remains remarkably consistent across time and geography. The weight you feel connects you to a lineage of human beings who have stared into the mystery of existence and asked the same uncomfortable questions. Schopenhauer's insight offers something valuable beyond diagnosis. If this feeling isn't personal, if it's actually a response to a fundamental condition of existence, then it's not evidence of your failure. It's evidence of your clarity. You're seeing something true about the nature of being alive, something that most people either don't notice or work very hard to avoid noticing. The exhaustion you feel isn't weakness. It's a kind of metaphysical honesty, a refusal to pretend that existence doesn't cost something, that consciousness isn't a weight as well as a gift. Over the next hour, we're going to explore this weight together. We'll look at how the will operates through you, how it structures every moment of your experience around lack and striving. We'll examine why being separate, being this particular person, rather than part of some unified whole, creates the conditions for this desire. We'll sit with the paradox at the heart of everything, that you cannot experience your own non-experience, cannot want your way out of wanting, and eventually, carefully, we'll consider what it might mean to live with this knowledge rather than be destroyed by it. This isn't about fixing you, because you're not broken. It's not about curing the desire to disappear, because that desire is trying to tell you something important. It's about understanding what Schopenhauer understood, what mystics and poets and exhausted people throughout history have understood, that sometimes the deepest truths about existence are the ones that hurt the most to acknowledge, and that acknowledging them, really sitting with them, might be the first step toward carrying the weight differently. The fog hasn't lifted, but at least now we can see that we're standing in it together, and the fog itself has a name, a history, a structure that extends far beyond this particular moment of pain. Schopenhauer called it the will, and understanding how it operates through you, how it makes you suffer while simultaneously making you alive. That understanding won't free you, but it might change everything about how you relate to the burden. Consider the last significant decision you made. Career change, relationship commitment, city relocation. Something that felt weighty and consequential. In the moment of choosing, it felt like genuine agency. You weighed options carefully, consulted your values, made what seemed like a free choice. But trace the causation backward. Your mood that day, influenced by sleep quality, itself influenced by stress patterns carved into you by childhood experiences you never asked for. Your values, absorbed from culture and family, before you were old enough to evaluate them critically. Your fears, etched into neural pathways by events you didn't choose to experience. Your capacity to reason, determined by genetics, nutrition, education, 1,000 factors entirely outside your control. Now locate the part that was actually you choosing, the irreducible core where something genuinely free made something genuinely happen. Where is it? Schopenhauer would say, nowhere. The machinery of causation runs all the way down. What remains isn't a self-making choices, but the will, that blind cosmic force we've been tracking, manifesting through the particular configuration temporarily called yourself, creating the illusion of agency to serve its own purposes. Every decision you think you're making freely is actually the will operating through you, using your consciousness as its vehicle. The cruelty becomes visible in ordinary moments. Sunday morning, nothing demands doing. Permission to rest has been granted, but within minutes, the restlessness arrives. That familiar itch underneath the skin. The phone gets picked up, each swipe feeling worse than the last, but impossible to stop. Getting up, making coffee nobody really wants, turning on a show that holds zero interest. What's happening? The will hungering for stimulus, for forward motion, for anything except the unbearable stillness of simply being. And notice what happens the moment one craving is satisfied. Immediately, the eyes are already searching for the next. Coffee hits the tongue, thoughts turn to food. Finish eating, already planning tonight's dinner. The will never rests, because rest would mean ceasing to be what it is. Schopenhauer called this striving without aim or end. Once noticed, it's everywhere. Watch carefully for just 1 hour. Count how many times there's reaching, wanting, planning, fearing, hoping. The motion is constant, There is never not wanting. Even in apparent contentment, look closely and find subtle anxiety. Background hum of what's next. The will doesn't care about happiness. It cares only that the striving continues, that its vehicles keep moving. Happiness, when it arrives, is bait. A brief reward that teaches continued chasing, continued wanting, continued service to purposes that were never chosen. But the deepest cut goes further still. The will has no purpose. Not that it has a purpose we don't understand, or that suffering builds toward hidden meaning we'll eventually grasp. The will is blind force, indifferent to pain, unaware even of its own existence. It simply is, and it simply wills, and consciousness simply suffers the consequences of being aware enough to experience its operation. Schopenhauer isn't saying meaning can't be created or value can't be found in individual lives. He's saying the force itself, the cosmic engine compelling existence, has no telos, no final purpose. Meaning can be constructed in life, but that construction doesn't change what's underneath. Something blind, indifferent, directionless. Stop for a moment. Right now, listening to this, what's being wanted? Perhaps answers. Perhaps better self-understanding. Perhaps permission to give up, or encouragement to continue, or validation that suffering means something. Notice the wanting. I know what you're thinking. I just said there's no you beneath the wanting, and now I'm asking what you want. The contradiction is intentional, because there's still the feeling of being someone who wants something. The experience persists, even if philosophically it's an illusion. And it's precisely in this gap, between the ontological truth that the self is just will manifesting, and the phenomenological reality that it feels like being someone, that the suffering lives. Schopenhauer isn't denying experience. He's explaining that what we call the self is the will's construction, maintained to serve its purposes. The you feels real because the will needs it to feel real to function. Notice how wanting shapes every second of experience. Thoughts cannot exist without being colored by attraction or aversion, hope or fear. The will's constant evaluation of everything according to its interests. The belief in seeking truth persists, but Schopenhauer's truth is this: there is no seeker beneath the seeking, only the will, temporarily experiencing itself through the illusion called consciousness. Take a breath. This is dense, possibly overwhelming. Stay with me though. This isn't about convincing anyone that life is meaningless or that giving up makes sense. This is about understanding why the desire to disappear makes such perfect sense, given the actual structure of existence. Schopenhauer wasn't a pessimist who hated life. He was a realist who refused to look away from what life actually is. Meditation promises to quiet the mind, but who wants to meditate? The will, seeking peace, wielding desire as its tool even in the attempt to transcend desire. Therapy offers to resolve issues, but who seeks resolution? The will, weaponizing pain to ensure continued motion toward an ever-receding horizon of wellness. Even suicide, the most radical escape imaginable, is just the will turning violently against itself, using desperation as fuel for its most dramatic act. Every exit leads back to the labyrinth's center because the one trying to escape and the thing being escaped from are the same. Understanding this doesn't dissolve it. The architecture of suffering can be seen perfectly clearly while remaining locked inside it. Consciousness doesn't grant escape. It only grants the unique torture of being aware of imprisonment while remaining powerless to break free. But here's where something interesting emerges. The desire to disappear. Why does it feel different from other desires? Why does it seem to point beyond the will's operation, instead of being just another manifestation of it? Schopenhauer had an answer. The desire to not exist is the will becoming conscious of its own purposelessness, its own futility. It's the moment when the blind force glimpses its blindness and recoils. But even this recoiling is just more will, more striving, now striving against itself, the snake swallowing its tail. Yet Schopenhauer didn't end his philosophy with this totalizing bleakness. He saw something else, something that won't become clear until we've gone deeper. The suffering being experienced isn't just from the will itself, it's from a specific form of its manifestation. It's from what Schopenhauer called the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, the illusion that we are separate, distinct, fundamentally alone. The will becomes tyrannical precisely because it fractures itself into billions of isolated wanting machines, each one convinced of its own individuality, each one competing with all the others, each one locked in the horror of solitary consciousness. What if the desire to disappear isn't really about escaping the will? What if it's about escaping the loneliness of being this particular manifestation of will, this separate self, this isolated consciousness? Schopenhauer saw that the will itself isn't individual. It's one vast force, one unified field of striving. But to be conscious means to be fooled into believing separation from that unity. And that separation, that illusion of being a distinct self cut off from everything else, that's where the deepest agony lives. If individuality is an illusion, if the boundaries between self and everything else are just tricks of perception, then who exactly is suffering? And who would disappear if the wish was granted? You're at a party. Someone asks how you've been, and you answer automatically, the script you've learned for these moments. And even while speaking, you're watching yourself perform the answer, aware that they're also performing their listening, both of you going through motions that approximate connection without achieving it. The conversation ends. You move to another room, another person, another performance, another exchange of signals that feel increasingly hollow, the more conscious you become of their mechanics. By the time you leave, you feel more alone than when you arrived. Not because people were unkind, because every interaction reminded you of the fundamental gap between consciousness and consciousness, the wall of subjectivity that no amount of language or effort can fully breach. You cannot climb inside someone else's experience. They cannot climb inside yours, and sometimes that recognition becomes unbearable. Schopenhauer called this the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation, and he considered it the primary mechanism of suffering. The will, that blind cosmic force we've been tracking, is actually unified, singular, one vast field of striving. But consciousness doesn't experience it that way. Consciousness experiences itself as fundamentally separate, locked inside a particular body, trapped behind a particular perspective, cut off from direct access to anything beyond the boundaries of self. We look at other people and see strangers, competitors, potential threats or allies, never recognizing what Schopenhauer saw with startling clarity. They are manifestations of the same will that animates us, temporary expressions of the same force, waves on the same ocean mistaking themselves for separate entities. Imagine the ocean believing itself to be millions of distinct waves, each one terrified of its own dissolution, each one competing with others for space and survival, none recognizing that beneath surface differences they're all the same water. This is what the principium individuationis does. It creates the illusion of separation, where none fundamentally exists. And that illusion, Schopenhauer argued, is the source of a suffering far deeper than the cycle of wanting and dissatisfaction. Because the isolation isn't just circumstantial. something that could be fixed through better communication or deeper relationships. The isolation is built into the structure of individual consciousness itself. Your body maintains this illusion at the most basic level. Skin marks where I end and not I begins. This body hungers, and only this hunger matters to it. This body feels pain, and that pain remains locked inside this particular nervous system, incommunicable in its raw intensity. When you tell someone, "I'm in pain," they hear those words through their history with pain, their own bodily associations, their memories and contexts. What they understand is their version of pain, not yours. The thing itself, the actual texture of what you're experiencing, stays trapped behind your eyes, unreachable, yours alone. No matter how someone sympathizes, they cannot feel what you feel. The boundary is absolute. Language promises to bridge this gap and fails constantly. You're trying to explain something important, searching for the right words, and even as you speak, you feel the inadequacy. The words point at experience, but cannot contain it. The listener nods, says they understand, and you know they understand something, but not the thing you actually meant. The gap persists. Every conversation is translation between private languages that only approximately overlap. Two people can witness the same event and construct entirely different internal realities from it, and neither can fully access the other's version. We build elaborate systems of communication, art, philosophy, desperate attempts to prove we're not completely alone. But Schopenhauer would say these attempts, however beautiful, never actually dissolve the fundamental separation. They just make it temporarily more bearable. Here's where the suffering intensifies beyond the merely philosophical. You don't just experience yourself as isolated. You experience yourself as isolated while desperately needing not to be isolated. This is where the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan adds crucial dimension to Schopenhauer's diagnosis. Lacan understood that from the moment consciousness develops, we're haunted by an imagined other, an internalized audience whose judgment we can never escape. He called this the big other, not an actual person, but a phantom constructed from fragments of real people, cultural messages, internalized expectations, our harshest self-judgments. And this big other is always watching, always evaluating, always finding us somehow insufficient. Last week, you said something in a meeting that landed wrong. You watched faces register confusion or judgment or polite disinterest. The moment passed. The meeting continued. But 3 days later, you're still replaying it, still burning with shame, still constructing elaborate fantasies of what you should have said instead. Who are you performing this shame for? The people in that meeting have forgotten already. They're not thinking about you. But the big other never forgets. The big other never stops watching. And the shame isn't really about the specific thing you said. It's about being seen, being exposed, being found wanting by that imagined tribunal that exists primarily in your own mind. The cruelty is structural. The big other is a phantom, but the feelings it generates are completely real. You organize your entire life around its imagined judgments. How many decisions get made, not based on what you actually want, but on what you think you should want? What would look right? What would earn approval from this audience that doesn't exist in the form you imagine? How much energy burns maintaining an image, performing a version of selfhood that seems acceptable, hiding parts that might be judged? And here's Lacan's devastating insight. You can never satisfy the big other because it's not real. It's your own construction, which means its standards shift constantly, always placing satisfaction just beyond reach. Schopenhauer would see this as another manifestation of the will's tyranny, the need for recognition, the desperate desire to matter in someone else's consciousness. This is the will driving you toward connection, while the principium individuation ensures genuine connection remains impossible. We are waves trying to touch other waves, never recognizing we're already the same ocean. The isolation is maintained by the very force that makes us crave escape from isolation. Another perfect trap, another way the blind machinery of existence perpetuates suffering through its own operation. Strip away all those imagined others for a moment. Remove every audience, every judgment, every external expectation. If you could exist without anyone watching, without any performance demanded, who would you be? Sit with that question. Don't answer quickly. Actually try to locate what would remain if all the other directed aspects of self were removed. Most people, if they're honest, find something deeply unsettling in this thought experiment, because so much of what we call self is actually performance. Reaction to imagined judgments, attempts to be what we think others want us to be. Remove the audience, and the actor becomes uncertain. Remove the judges, and the defendant forgets why they're defending. Is there anything underneath the performance? Or is the self itself just a collection of responses to others, a mask worn so long it's fused to the face? The desire to disappear makes perfect sense against this background. It's not just about escaping the will's endless wanting. It's about escaping the unbearable burden of being a separate self, fundamentally alone, while desperately needing not to be alone, caught in this paradox where connection is necessary, but ultimately impossible. When you fantasize about dissolving, part of what you're fantasizing about is the end of this performance, the end of this exhausting vigilance about how you're being perceived, the end of this private theater where you're forever separated from genuine contact with anything outside the boundaries of self. Buddhist and Hindu philosophy recognized this thousands of years before Schopenhauer or Lacan. In Buddhist thought, anatta, the doctrine of no self, points directly at what we're describing. The self we experience as solid and continuous is actually a construct, a useful fiction maintained by consciousness, but ultimately empty of inherent existence. In Hindu philosophy, the recognition that Atman, individual soul, and Brahman, universal reality, are actually identical dissolves the illusion of separation. Schopenhauer studied these traditions deeply and found in them confirmation of what he'd arrived at through Western philosophy. Individuality itself is the problem, not any particular circumstance or psychological pattern. But here's what must be understood before moving forward. Knowing intellectually that separation is illusory doesn't dissolve the experiential reality of loneliness. You can grasp philosophically that you're a temporary wave in an eternal ocean. You can understand conceptually that the boundaries between self and other are constructs. And tomorrow morning, you still wake in this body, behind these eyes, trapped in this perspective, unable to directly access any consciousness except your own. The philosophical insight and the phenomenological prison remain separated by a gap that thinking cannot bridge. Perhaps, though, understanding shifts something even without dissolving the structure. Perhaps recognizing that everyone else is also a manifestation of the same will, also suffering from the same illusion of separation, creates different quality of aloneness, not transcendence, something more modest. You're still isolated in your private experience, but you know with certainty that everyone you see is also isolated in theirs, and that shared isolation is somehow less absolute than believing yourself uniquely trapped. Schopenhauer called this compassion, and we'll return to what that might mean. But first, we need to understand what we actually do with this desire. how it manifests in behavior, what we reach for when the ache of separation becomes too heavy to carry, 3 a.m. The glow of the phone screen illuminates a face that hasn't changed position in 40 minutes. Thumb scrolling, eyes glazing over content that registers and immediately evaporates. A video about nothing, an argument between strangers, images of lives being performed for an audience of millions. The body knows this isn't rest. The mind knows this isn't pleasure. Yet the scrolling continues, mechanical, compulsive, a motion divorced from any genuine want. This is rehearsal, practice for a disappearance more permanent than sleep. We fetishize oblivion in ways we rarely acknowledge. The word fetish is appropriate here, not as provocation, but as precision. A fetish, in its original anthropological sense, is an object believed to have magical power, something that becomes obsessively sought, despite rarely delivering on its promise. And that's exactly what we do with nothingness. We pursue it frantically through 1,000 small deaths, each one offering temporary relief from the burden of consciousness, each one failing to truly satisfy, each one leaving us hungry for the next dose of erasure. Alcohol is perhaps the most obvious example, not the social drinking, not the glass of wine with dinner, the drinking alone, the drinking to numb, the drinking to create distance between yourself and the raw fact of being yourself. Schopenhauer understood that intoxication wasn't simply about pleasure. It was about dimming consciousness, about creating temporary respite from the will's relentless operation. When drunk enough, the internal monologue quiets. The anxiety about tomorrow fades. The shame about yesterday loses its sharp edges. For a few hours, the weight lifts, not because anything has actually changed, but because the capacity to fully feel the weight has been chemically suppressed. But notice what happens afterward. The hangover isn't just physical. There's a psychological rebound, a return of everything that was temporarily muted, often intensified now by the added layer of guilt and self-disgust. The will comes roaring back, sometimes with doubled force, as if punishing the attempt at escape. And yet the pattern repeats, again and again, seeking that temporary dimming, that brief window where consciousness feels less like a curse. The fetish reveals itself in the repetition despite the consequences, in the knowing that it won't really help but reaching for it anyway, because the alternative, sitting with the full weight of aware existence, feels impossible. Dissociation operates differently but serves the same purpose. You're in a conversation and suddenly you're not. You're watching yourself from somewhere outside your body, observing your mouth moving but feeling no connection to the words emerging from it. Or you're driving and arrive at your destination with no memory of the journey, as if someone else piloted your body while you were elsewhere. These aren't always voluntary. Often they're the psyche's protective mechanism, a circuit breaker that flips when the current of experience becomes too intense. But sometimes, if you pay attention, you can feel yourself reaching for dissociation, actively seeking that strange detachment where you become an observer of your life, rather than a participant in it. The appeal is obvious. If being a self is exhausting, if the prison of individuality becomes unbearable, then becoming a spectator of that self offers relief. You're still technically here, still technically alive, but the identification loosens. The walls become transparent. For a moment, you're not trapped inside the theater of consciousness. You're in the cheap seats, watching the show with emotional distance. It's a kind of practice death, a temporary withdrawal from the exhausting project of being someone without the permanence or violence of actual dying. Then there's the scrolling, the numbing consumption of content that demands nothing and gives nothing. Hours vanish into feeds designed to exploit the exact mechanisms Schopenhauer identified. Each swipe provides a tiny hit of novelty, just enough stimulus to keep the will temporarily occupied, never enough to actually satisfy. It's the digital equivalent of those experiments where rats press a lever for electrical stimulation of their pleasure centers, pressing and pressing until they collapse from exhaustion, choosing the stimulus over food or water or connection. We scroll ourselves into a trance state, consciousness narrowed to a thin beam of shallow attention, everything else blurred out. It's not rest, it's not pleasure, it's self-administered anesthesia. Sleep itself becomes fetishized, not the natural sleep of a tired body, but the wished-for sleep of someone who wants to stop being conscious. How many times has the thought arrived, I just want to sleep and never wake up? It sounds like a death wish, and perhaps it is, but notice the specific quality of it. Not the violence of suicide, not the finality of cessation, just sleep continuing indefinitely, consciousness switched off like a light, no effort required, no mess left behind. The fantasy is of permission to simply stop, to be released from the obligation of awareness without having to do anything dramatic or final to achieve it. But here's where Schopenhauer's distinction becomes crucial. All of these small deaths, these temporary escapes, these practices of numbing and dissociating and diminishing consciousness, they're not what he meant by negation of the will. In fact, they're often the opposite. They're the will thrashing against itself, using its own energy to try to destroy its own operation, which is just another form of striving, another expression of the very thing being attempted to escape. Suicide, the ultimate version of this pattern, is what Schopenhauer called the most violent affirmation of the will. It's not transcendence, it's desperation wielding violence against itself. The person who takes their own life doesn't actually want to stop wanting. They want life, but a different life. They want existence without suffering. They want to be rid of the pain while keeping the possibility of pleasure. But since that's impossible, since the will and suffering are inseparable, they settle for destroying the vehicle through which the will manifests. It's like smashing a mirror because you hate your reflection. The mirror breaks, but you remain. Or in Schopenhauer's framework, the individual manifestation is destroyed, but the will itself continues, churning out new forms, new vehicles for its blind striving. Real negation of the will, according to Schopenhauer, is something else entirely. It's not violent, it's not sudden, it's a gradual withdrawal of identification with the will's purposes, a slow loosening of desire's grip. It's not about destroying consciousness, but about transforming its relationship to wanting. And that transformation, if it's possible at all, doesn't come through the small deaths we practice. It comes through something harder and more paradoxical: clear seeing, sustained attention to the will's operation without trying to fight it or flee from it. Years ago, seeking to understand this desire for dissolution, I stepped into a sensory deprivation tank, floating in that darkness, suspended in body temperature water so salty that the boundaries between body and liquid blur. Something strange happens. Time becomes meaningless. The body becomes ambiguous, and what remains is just bare awareness, consciousness experiencing itself without content, without object, without even a clear sense of where the boundary between self and not self exists. It's not peaceful in any conventional sense. It's more like discovering that what you thought was solid is actually something much more fluid and uncertain than you believed. The edges soften, the solidity dissolves. For a few moments, or maybe hours, the principium individuationis loosens its grip, and there's a quality to that loosening that's both terrifying and strangely relieving. You're still here, but the you that's here feels fundamentally different. Walking out afterward, back into light and sound, and the world of distinct objects and clear boundaries, something has shifted slightly. Not transcendence, not enlightenment, just a temporary glimpse of what existence might feel like with less rigid identification, with the boundaries of self drawn less darkly. The relief isn't from escaping the will, it's from briefly experiencing a different relationship to being an individual manifestation of it. But the tank itself is just another tool, another method, another thing the will can use to seek relief from its own operation. The danger is making it into one more fetish object, one more magical solution that promises escape but delivers only temporary respite. The pattern repeats at every level. We seek nothingness through chemicals, through dissociation, through scrolling ourselves into oblivion, through sensory deprivation, through meditation retreats and spiritual practices and therapeutic interventions. And sometimes these things help. Sometimes they create space, offer perspective, shift something meaningful. But none of them are escape routes. They're just different ways of living with the same fundamental condition. The question isn't how to finally disappear. The question is why the desire to disappear manifests in these specific ways, through these particular practices and substances and behaviors. What are we actually reaching for? And what would it mean to stop reaching while somehow continuing to exist? 7 minutes, you check again. 9 minutes now. The afternoon stretches ahead like an empty highway, disappearing into haze, and you're stuck at the beginning of it, with nowhere urgent to go and nothing that needs immediate doing. The phone offers its usual distractions, but they've all been exhausted. Every app opened and closed. Every feed scrolled to its temporary end. The boredom isn't the worst part. Worse is the awareness of yourself being bored, consciousness forced to watch itself search desperately for anything to occupy the next hour and the hour after that, and all the hours until sleep finally arrives to grant temporary erasure. Time has become visible, and time, when visible, is unbearable. Schopenhauer understood that the will's tyranny operates not just through space, but through duration. We are not merely wanting machines. We are wanting machines that must continue wanting through every sequential moment of existence without pause or reprieve. The will doesn't grant intermissions. It demands constant motion, constant striving, and when circumstances force stillness, when there's nothing immediate to pursue or flee from, the machinery of wanting grinds against itself. Boredom, in Schopenhauer's framework, is the will experiencing its own purposelessness. You're not bored because nothing interesting is available. You're bored because in the absence of external objects to pursue, the will's blind striving becomes apparent. The engine runs, but there's no road. The hunger persists, but there's nothing to consume. And so, you sit there, trapped in your own restless mechanism. Time stretching impossibly long, because each second must be filled with wanting that has nowhere to go. What makes this temporal dimension uniquely torturous is that consciousness remembers. Yesterday you felt this same restlessness. Last week you experienced this same empty duration. You recognize the pattern because you've lived through it dozens, hundreds, thousands of times. And worse, you can project forward. Tomorrow will contain the same structure, the same cycle of wanting and dissatisfaction, the same desperate search for something to make time pass. Schopenhauer called this the eternal recurrence of willing, each day a repetition of the fundamental pattern with only superficial variations. The will doesn't learn, it doesn't grow. It simply repeats its operation through time, dragging consciousness along behind it, forcing awareness to experience the same cycle endlessly. Søren Kierkegaard mapped this temporal trap from a different angle, but arrived at remarkably similar terrain. He called it the sickness unto death, and despite the theological dressing, his diagnosis cuts to something experientially precise. Despair, for Kierkegaard, isn't sadness or even suffering exactly. It's the anguish of being unable to escape from yourself through time. You are this person now. You were this person yesterday. You will be this person tomorrow. The self persists, unchanging in its fundamental structure despite all surface modifications, and that persistence becomes its own form of torture. Most people, Kierkegaard argued, structure their entire lives around avoiding this recognition. They stay busy, they chase novelty, they construct elaborate narratives about growth and change. But in moments of enforced stillness, when the distractions fail, the truth emerges. You cannot stop being yourself even for a second. Depression reveals this with brutal clarity. Not the crying kind necessarily, though that happens. The numb kind. The kind where you wake and the day is already exhausted before it begins. Nothing will happen because nothing can happen, because happening requires energy, and energy requires caring, and caring requires some belief that change is possible. But you've been here before. You know this state. You recognize its textures and duration, and the particular quality of hours passing without anything actually occurring. Schopenhauer would say the will has temporarily suspended its operation, leaving you aware but unmotivated, conscious but undriven. Kierkegaard would say you're experiencing despair in its purest form, the self forced to endure itself without distraction or escape. Both are describing the same phenomenon from different languages. Time becoming prison, consciousness becoming burden, the eternal present revealing itself as eternal torment. Watch what happens during a long weekend with no plans. Saturday morning arrives with possibility. By Saturday afternoon, the restlessness has started. By Sunday morning, you're already exhausted by the prospect of more unstructured time. By Sunday evening, you're almost relieved that Monday will arrive with its obligations and demands. Not because you enjoy work, because structure makes time move. Without external demands pulling you forward, you're left alone with the will's purposeless churning. And that churning, when experienced directly without the numbing effect of constant activity, is almost unendurable. You find yourself creating tasks, manufacturing urgency, doing things you don't need to do simply to avoid the confrontation with raw duration. This is where Schopenhauer's insight about the will and Kierkegaard's insight about despair interlock perfectly. The will operates as blind striving through time. Consciousness experiences that striving as an eternal present that never resolves into genuine satisfaction. You're caught between the will's endless forward motion and consciousness's recognition that the motion leads nowhere. The only options appear to be constant distraction, which eventually exhausts itself, or direct encounter with the purposeless engine grinding away inside you, which is psychologically unbearable. Either way, time becomes oppressor. Either you're fleeing from it through constant occupation, or you're trapped in it, experiencing its slow, cruel passage, while the will generates need after need that nothing permanently satisfies. Nostalgia operates here as a particularly insidious form of temporal torture. You find yourself dwelling on the past, not because it was actually better, though memory edits generously, but because memory offers the illusion of escape from the present moment. In reminiscence, you're traveling backward, revisiting younger selves, reliving experiences that felt more vivid, more real, more meaningful than whatever this current moment contains. But the remembering happens now. The nostalgia is experienced by this present self, trapped in this present moment, unable to actually return to anything. Schopenhauer would note that even your memories are manifestations of will, consciousness generating desire for something irretrievably lost, creating lack where none existed. The past you're nostalgic for was also characterized by wanting, also contained suffering, also failed to provide lasting satisfaction. But distance and selective memory transform it into paradise lost, and so you torture yourself with visions of a time that never existed in the form you remember it, unable to go back, but also unable to stop wanting to go back. Kierkegaard distinguished between different forms of despair, but they all share this temporal structure, the self in anguish over its own persistence. The person who despairs doesn't want to die in the conventional sense. They want to not be this particular self, this configuration of patterns and history, an inescapable identity that continues existing through time, regardless of what they consciously want. You can decide to change. You can commit to transformation. You can promise yourself that this time will be different, and then you watch yourself fall into the same patterns, react in the same ways, repeat the same mistakes. The self reasserts itself, not because you're weak or broken, but because the self is a structure that perpetuates itself through time. Schopenhauer would say it's the will maintaining its particular manifestation. Kierkegaard would say it's the eternal in you, the unchanging core that persists despite all efforts at modification. Sit with this for a moment, the person you are right now reading this, with your specific anxieties and desires and ways of relating to the world. Imagine being this person tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, forever. Not metaphorically, actually forever, or at least for as long as consciousness persists. No transformation that alters the fundamental patterns, no growth that escapes the core structure. Just you as you are, continuing through time, experiencing the same cycle of wanting and dissatisfaction with only superficial variations. The horror isn't that life is short. The horror, if you see it clearly, is that it might be long, that you might have to continue being yourself, carrying this particular self through time for decades still to come. And yet, here's what both Schopenhauer and Kierkegaard saw. Most people never consciously encounter this. They stay sufficiently busy, sufficiently distracted, sufficiently convinced by narratives of progress and meaning, that the fundamental structure remains hidden. Only in certain states, depression, extreme boredom, prolonged isolation, does time become visible as prison and self become visible as eternal burden. The desire to disappear in this context is the desire to escape, not just from wanting, but from having to be the one who wants, through time, continuously, without relief. If you could dissolve, you'd be free from duration itself, from the terrible obligation to continue existing sequentially, moment after moment, always as yourself. Kierkegaard believed only religious faith could resolve this despair, the self finding its proper relation to eternity through relationship with God. That solution will satisfy some and alienate others. Schopenhauer offered something different but equally difficult, the recognition that time itself is part of the illusion of individuation. The will is timeless, eternal in its operation. Only its individual manifestations experience themselves as temporal beings with beginnings and endings. If consciousness could genuinely see through the veil, could recognize itself as temporary expression of something larger and eternal, perhaps the burden of carrying a self through time would lighten, not disappear, but lose some of its crushing weight. But that recognition, if it comes at all, doesn't arrive through understanding. You can grasp intellectually that the self is illusory, that time is a construct of consciousness, that you're a temporary wave in an eternal ocean, and still you wake tomorrow and must be yourself again, must experience duration again, must carry the weight through another day of wanting that leads nowhere. The gap between philosophical understanding and phenomenological reality remains vast, perhaps unbridgeable, which returns us to the fundamental question. If you cannot escape yourself, and you cannot escape time, and you cannot use understanding to dissolve either one, then what? How do you endure the eternal recurrence of being yourself, a snake swallowing its own tail? Ouroboros, the ancient symbol appearing across cultures, representing cycles, eternity, self-consumption. But look closer at what it actually depicts. A creature sustaining itself by destroying itself, existing through the process of its own negation. The image is profoundly uncomfortable because it captures something true about the desire we've been circling. To want non-existence is to create a logical structure exactly like that snake. The wanting itself is the problem. But solving the problem requires wanting the solution, which recreates the problem, which demands another solution, which requires more wanting. The circle closes perfectly, infinitely, maddeningly. You cannot experience non-experience. State it plainly, and the paradox becomes undeniable. The moment there's awareness of anything, including awareness of nothing, experience is happening. Consciousness observing itself, even in the act of trying to stop observing, remains consciousness. The desire to disappear requires a desirer. The wish to dissolve requires someone doing the wishing. And the moment that someone achieves what they want, there's no one left to experience the achievement. Success and the experiencer of success are mutually exclusive. You can't get what you want because the getting requires a you, and the thing being wanted is the absence of you. Schopenhauer understood this perfectly. It's why he was so careful to distinguish between suicide, which is the will violently destroying one of its manifestations, and genuine negation of the will, which is something else entirely. The person who takes their own life doesn't actually want to stop wanting. They want relief. They want peace. They want out. All wants, all will, operating through the illusion of individual choice. The suicide, Schopenhauer argued, wants life, but a different life, existence without suffering. Since that's impossible, since the will and suffering are inseparable, they settle for destroying the vehicle. It's like smashing a mirror because you hate your reflection. The mirror breaks, but you remain. If violent cessation doesn't work, if thinking your way out is impossible, because thinking is itself manifestation of the will, if every method is compromised from the start, then what? This is where Schopenhauer turned to traditions that had grappled with this paradox for millennia, before Western philosophy caught up. Buddhism, particularly, had mapped this territory with startling precision. Walk into any meditation center today, and you'll find people sitting still, watching their breath, trying desperately to achieve peace. But notice what's driving them there. They want to feel better. They want to reduce anxiety. They want to fix themselves. The wanting is so fundamental, they can't see it operating even in the attempt to transcend it. The market for enlightenment is vast and profitable, precisely because people are desperate for solutions to the problem Schopenhauer diagnosed. Apps promising peace, retreats guaranteeing transformation, teachers selling awakening. And underneath all of it, the will still operating, still seeking, now seeking the end of seeking. But the Buddha wasn't selling anything. His diagnosis was ruthlessly precise. Dukkha, suffering, the inherent unsatisfactoriness of conditioned existence. Everything arising is impermanent and therefore cannot provide lasting satisfaction. Sound familiar? It's Schopenhauer's analysis of the will's operation, articulated 25 centuries earlier. Life is characterized by tanha, craving, which is never permanently satisfied. Each satisfaction is temporary. Each fulfillment immediately reveals new lack. The cycle continues. But the Buddha didn't stop at diagnosis. Dukkha has a cause. Craving, yes, but more fundamentally, avidya, ignorance. Not ignorance of facts, but ignorance of the nature of reality. And what are we ignorant of? Anatta, no self. We suffer because we believe in the reality of a permanent, unchanging self that's doing the experiencing, making the choices, carrying the burden. But that self, Buddhism argues, is a construct, a useful fiction maintained by consciousness, ultimately empty of inherent existence. Schopenhauer saw the parallel immediately. His principium individuationis, the illusion that makes us believe we're separate, distinct entities, maps directly onto Buddhist teachings about anatta. We think we're waves with independent existence. We're temporary formations in the ocean, arising and dissolving, never actually separate from the water that constitutes us. The suffering comes from identifying with the waveform and forgetting the ocean. Or in Schopenhauer's language, we identify with our individual manifestation of will and forget that beneath the appearance of multiplicity, there's only the one unified force, blind and purposeless, churning out forms that mistake themselves for independent beings. You're sitting in traffic, late for something important. The frustration builds, tightening chest and jaw, generating elaborate fantasies of yelling at whoever made you late. But who's frustrated? Locate the frustrator. Not the thoughts about frustration, those come and go. Not the bodily sensations, those shift and change. Not the situation, that's external. Where is the actual self that's experiencing this? The more precisely you look, the harder it becomes to find anything stable. There's experiencing happening, yes, but an experiencer, a solid thing that remains constant beneath the changing states. Buddhism would say, look more carefully. Schopenhauer would say, what you're looking for is the illusion we've been tracking all along. So the Buddhist path isn't about destroying the self through violence. It's about seeing through the illusion of self through sustained attention. Meditation, in this context, isn't relaxation or wellness or any of the ways it's been commodified. It's a practice of sustained observation of consciousness itself, watching thoughts arise and dissolve, watching sensations emerge and fade, until the pattern becomes undeniable. There is no stable thing here that's doing the experiencing. There's just experience, happening, arising from conditions, empty of inherent self-nature. This is where the paradox deepens rather than resolves. Because even if you see clearly that the self is a construct, even if you intellectually grasp that individuality is illusory, you still wake up in this body tomorrow. You still have this history. You still experience consciousness from this particular perspective and not from any other. The philosophical insight and the phenomenological reality remain separated by a gap that's nearly impossible to bridge. Understanding that the self is empty doesn't make it stop functioning as a construct. Seeing that boundaries are illusory doesn't dissolve individuation. Buddhist practice claims that with enough sustained attention, something can shift. Not through effort exactly, but through a kind of allowing, a a cessation of the constant grasping and aversion that normally structures experience. The mind can learn to rest in awareness without constantly identifying with the contents of awareness. Thoughts arise, but you're not the thinker. Sensations occur, but you're not the owner of sensation. Experience happens, but there's no experiencer. Or more precisely, the experiencer is revealed as another experience, not the fundamental ground it pretends to be. Schopenhauer pointed to something similar through different language, in aesthetic contemplation, in pure observation of beauty or sublimity. The will temporarily suspends its operation, standing before a mountain or hearing music that's genuinely transcendent. And for a moment, wanting stops. You're not trying to possess the mountain or use it for any purpose. You're not analyzing the music or comparing it to other music. You're simply aware of it purely, without the mediating layer of desire or aversion. And in those moments, Schopenhauer argued, there's temporary liberation from the will's tyranny. Not because the will has been destroyed, but because you've found a way of existing where its operation is suspended, however briefly. But even this needs to be said carefully. The danger is making this into another fetish object, another magical solution that promises escape but delivers only temporary respite. Some practices create genuine shifts in how consciousness relates to itself, but the structure of seeking remains. The person trying to meditate their way to peace is still seeking, still wanting, still caught in the fundamental bind. What remains after we've seen the paradox clearly, after we understand that we can't think our way out, can't want our way out, can't practice our way out, at least not in any straightforward sense, after we recognize that every solution contains the seeds of the problem it's trying to solve, what do we do with the desire to disappear once we see that disappearance is logically impossible and every path toward it is compromised? Maybe the question has been wrong from the start. Maybe it was never about how to stop existing. Maybe it's about how to exist differently, not transcendence, which places the solution somewhere unreachable, not escape, which assumes there's somewhere else to go, but a different quality of presence, a different way of carrying the weight that Schopenhauer and the Buddha both recognized as fundamental to conscious existence. Not freedom from the burden, but perhaps, occasionally, carrying it more lightly. Morning light through the window, traffic sounds filtering up from the street, the ordinary world reasserting itself with its familiar weight and texture. You're back in time, back in sequence, back in the prison of being someone who must continue being someone through every moment until sleep offers its nightly intermission. The weight returns, but something has shifted imperceptibly in the quality of the returning. As if briefly glimpsing the fluidity underneath solid forms creates a small gap between you and the absolute identification with being you. The suffering doesn't disappear. The burden doesn't lighten in any measurable way, but the relationship to it shifts almost too subtly to name. Schopenhauer spent hundreds of pages mapping the architecture of suffering before offering anything resembling a way forward. And even then, he didn't promise escape or transcendence or any of the fantasies that spiritual marketplaces sell. What he pointed toward was something more difficult and more honest. Different ways of existing within the prison that make imprisonment less total, less suffocating. The most profound of these, the one he returned to persistently, was compassion. Not sentimentality or performed kindness, but something more radical. The experiential recognition that the person suffering in front of you is not fundamentally separate from you. Their pain is your pain, because beneath the illusion of individuation, you are both manifestations of the same will. This recognition doesn't arrive through thinking about it. Intellectual understanding that we're all one won't create compassion any more than reading about water creates wetness. But sometimes, watching someone fall into the exact pattern you fall into, seeing them struggle with what struggles you, something shifts. The separateness reveals itself as thinner than it usually appears. They are doing what you do. They are caught in what catches you. They are suffering from what makes you suffer. And in that moment, the boundaries that normally make judgment or indifference possible begin to dissolve. Not permanently, not completely, but enough to change the texture of how you exist in relation to their existence. When you genuinely see that harming another is harming yourself, when you viscerally understand that their suffering is your suffering, then kindness becomes as natural as pulling your hand from fire, not because it's virtuous, but because it's obvious. Schopenhauer argued that genuine moral action flows from this recognition, not from rules or duty or fear of consequences. The compassion he's describing isn't a feeling you generate through effort. It's what remains when the illusion of separation temporarily lifts, when the veil of Maya becomes momentarily transparent. But this doesn't cure the desire to disappear. Compassion doesn't eliminate the exhaustion of being someone, or the horror of individuation, or the tyranny of the will. What it provides is brief moments where the burden is shared rather than carried alone. When you recognize that everyone else is also trapped in this, also suffering from consciousness, also exhausted by the demands of maintaining a self, the isolation fractures slightly. You're still alone in your private theater of experience. But you know, with certainty that goes beyond mere belief, that everyone else is also alone in their private theater. And somehow this shared aloneness is less absolute than pure solitude. There's a moment in Neon Genesis Evangelion where Shinji, drowning in isolation and self-hatred, faces a choice. He can accept the dissolution of all boundaries, merging with all consciousness, ending separation forever. Or he can return to the world of distinct individuals, to the pain of being separate, to the endless possibility of rejection and misunderstanding and loneliness. The show doesn't pretend the choice is easy or obvious. Individuality is suffering. Connection is impossible. Others will hurt you. You will hurt them. And yet, Shinji chooses to remain individual, to continue suffering the burden of being someone, because something in him recognizes that total dissolution is also the death of any possibility of genuine encounter. If everyone merges into one, there's no other to reach toward, no gap to try to bridge. The choice to remain separate is simultaneously a choice to remain available to others who are also suffering the same separation. Schopenhauer saw this too. The tragedy of separation is also what makes compassion possible. If we weren't fundamentally isolated, there would be nothing profound about reaching across the gap toward another's pain. The difficulty is what gives the reaching its weight. The impossibility of perfect understanding is what makes the attempt at understanding meaningful. We can never fully know each other, but we can recognize each other as fellow prisoners, and that recognition, however incomplete, matters. None of this resolves the paradox. You still can't experience non-experience. You still can't want your way out of wanting. The desire to disappear will return, maybe tomorrow, maybe tonight, maybe while reading these words. And when it returns, philosophy won't make it feel less real or less urgent. Schopenhauer offers no cure because there is no cure. The condition is existence itself. But perhaps understanding changes the texture of the desire. When it arrives, that longing for dissolution, maybe you can recognize it not as personal failure, but as consciousness glimpsing the fundamental structure of what it is to be alive. Maybe you can sit with it for a moment before reaching for the numbing, the dissociating, the small deaths that promise relief, but deliver only temporary forgetting. Maybe in that moment of sitting with it, something loosens. Not transcendence, not escape, just a slight softening of the death grip you've been maintaining on the fiction of being someone. The mystics talk about ego death as if it's a destination, a final breakthrough after which everything is different. But perhaps it's more accurate to think of it as moments, scattered and unpredictable, where the ego's grip weakens temporarily before reasserting itself. The wave doesn't become the ocean permanently, but sometimes, briefly, it remembers what it's made of. Schopenhauer spent his final years in relative peace, or so the accounts suggest. Not happiness, not the satisfaction that comes from achieving desires, but a settled quality that comes from understanding the game clearly enough to stop fighting it quite so desperately. He never claimed to have transcended the will. He remained human, which means he remained subject to its operation until death, but he found a way to exist within that subjection that involved less thrashing, less desperate grasping for escape routes that don't exist. Perhaps that's all that's available. Not freedom from the burden, but occasional brief respites where it's carried more lightly. The desire to disappear taught me something I couldn't have learned any other way. It forced me to look directly at what I usually avoid. The raw fact of being conscious, of being individual, of being trapped in time and self, and the endless operation of wanting. And what I found, looking directly at it, wasn't the peaceful acceptance that spiritual bypassing promises. It was just the thing itself, seen clearly. The weight of being someone, the tyranny of the will, the sickness of carrying a self through time, all of it real, all of it unavoidable. But seeing it clearly, even without solving it, changes something. The desperate quality lessens, the panic subsides slightly, not because anything has actually changed about the structure of existence, but because fighting what can't be changed consumes more energy than accepting it. You will feel the desire to disappear again. I will feel it again. Everyone listening to this will feel it again. The weight will return. The exhaustion will reassert itself. The longing for dissolution will whisper its promises. And when it comes, you can fight it, which is exhausting. You can numb it, which works until it doesn't. Or you can sit with it just for a moment and recognize it as consciousness seeing something true about its own nature. Not pathology, not failure, just the mind glimpsing the paradox at the heart of being alive, that existence is simultaneously precious and unbearable, that consciousness is both gift and curse, that the self we desperately want to escape is also the only vehicle we have for experiencing anything at all. The void remains. It will always remain. But you don't have to fall into it today. You can carry your weight a little longer. Not because there's promised reward or hidden meaning or eventual transcendence, but because the alternative, the final disappearance, is also the end of any possibility of these brief moments where the weight lifts slightly. These moments where you see someone else struggling with the same burden and recognize them. These moments where beauty suspends wanting temporarily. These moments where you glimpse, however briefly, that the prison you're in is also the prison everyone is in, and somehow that shared imprisonment is less total than absolute isolation. The psychology of wanting to disappear isn't pathology. It's clarity seeing itself. And maybe, just maybe, that clarity can become something other than suffering. Not its opposite, just something different. A way of bearing what must be borne with slightly less desperation and slightly more grace.